So I've shown the Ally a lot of love on this channel over the past several weeks, both with it being my latest hardware acquisition and all, and I've definitely spent some time singing its praises, particularly when it comes to how it performs with bigger, beefier AAA titles. But as much as I've enjoyed playing with the Ally over the past several weeks, there are a lot of areas where the deck demonstrably comes out on top, and that's what today's video is all about. It's highlighting a few of the key areas where the deck absolutely dunks on the Ally, or at least provides a better experience overall. So let's go ahead and go over a few of those differences, starting with the most obvious stuff to the least obvious stuff, because some of the stuff was immediately apparent, and it will be to you as well if you have a chance to compare and contrast the deck against the Ally, but then some of them I really only sussed out after spending a few weeks with both systems. So all that being said, let's just go ahead and start with what is probably the most obvious advantage that the deck has over the Ally, and that is battery life. Now, it's undeniable that the Ally makes for a gorgeous gaming experience, particularly for heavy-hitting AAA titles. Between double the graphical power and that 1080p screen, I have been thoroughly enjoying replaying Spider-Man Remastered. But I've noticed that I also have to remain really cognizant of battery drain when playing on the Ally, because this thing will absolutely crush whatever battery life you have left. Normally I can get through a couple of main story missions and maybe a little bit of open world patrolling in Spider-Man, but it only takes about an hour to catch that low battery warning. And it's true that more taxing titles can chew through battery on the deck as well, but you get just a little bit more time to play, and it's definitely noticeable. I realize that's a sort of subjective thing, but if you spend time hopping between the two systems playing the same game, you'll notice that you're a lot less likely to go hunting for an outlet or a backup battery when you're playing on the deck. Granted, the way I'm explaining it is a little bit anecdotal, but if you wanted to get a better idea of battery drain on either system, that sort of brings me to my next point where I think the deck comes out on top over the Ally, and that is the ability to get to that performance information quickly and easily through its software. For starters, the performance overlay on the deck is much better, and I really hope that this is something they improve on for the Ally. At its lowest level, the performance overlay on the deck is just a small FPS readout in the corner of the screen, but even if you want more detailed info like remaining battery or GPU, CPU, RAM utilization, you can relegate that to a thin bar at the top to pretty easily keep an eye on performance without it being too distracting. Unfortunately, on the Ally, there's only one performance overlay option, and it takes up a pretty significant chunk of in-game real estate in the upper right that also makes that region of the screen completely inaccessible when using the touchscreen or the mouse, and since that's where the X button lands to close out of full-screen applications, even using it starts to become sort of a hindrance to navigation, in addition to just being kind of an eyesore. But putting aside that the Ally's performance overlay isn't very customizable or aesthetically pleasing, the other issue is that it's really the only way that you can get an idea of how much battery you have remaining while you're playing in-game. And if you just want a quick glance at your battery life, the slide over Command Center where you go to Quick Settings doesn't show your remaining battery life by default, whereas the Steam Deck plainly displays this as soon as you hit either the three dots or the Steam button. So if you want to see how much battery you have left on the Ally, you either have to hit the Armory Crate button to pull up that interface again, or swipe up to bring up the Windows interface and get a quick glance at your system tray, which really doesn't tell you the remaining percentage without an additional tap in this area. The problem with this is Armory Crate is kinda buggy, and it doesn't always respond immediately if you have a game fired up, and pressing the button again to jump back to your game just randomly doesn't work sometimes. Which means that if you just want to get a quick look at how much use you have left, you have to really break the immersion of the game that you're playing and jump through extra hoops just to see that information. All of this is to say that there needs to be a better way to monitor battery life easily on the Ally, and this seems like a pretty glaring omission for a handheld that's often going to be leaning on battery power for play sessions. Now, beyond just making it easier to identify how much juice you have left, another area where I think the deck comes out on top is that I think it's a lot easier to get out of a game that you're playing, and I think a lot of this is really thanks to the unified Steam interface. On the Ally, it's more flexible in terms of what you can install locally, which is a huge help if you have a bunch of games from alternate marketplaces, but sometimes it feels like you're juggling multiple interfaces between Armory Crate, Steam, and any other marketplaces that you've installed, which has often led to me just setting the Ally in Steam Big Picture mode by default and to just leave it there, bypassing Armory Crate as often as I'm able. But more than the raw interface of navigating your libraries, it's also a lot easier to shut down a game on the deck than it is on the Ally. I've gotten so accustomed to the loop of hit Steam button, then D-pad right, then D-pad down to the exit game option, that I sort of took it for granted, and by comparison the Ally's approach is clunkier since you usually have to use the game's interface that you're in to go ahead and hop back to the games menu, and then hit a quit game or exit to desktop option. Now I suppose if you're using a keyboard you could use Alt F4 to accomplish the same, or use the analog stick and your bumper shoulder buttons to right click and exit the game from the Windows taskbar, but much like trying to find out how much battery life you have left, these tiny extra steps, even if they've only taken a few seconds, really add up and detract from the experience. Now, to Ally's credit, in a recent update they did add an option to force kill a task in the Command Center slide over interface, which is a step in the right direction, but at least a few times I've used it so far, it did immediately kill the game, but then it didn't bring up Steam or Armory Crate again for me to select another game. Also, I should point out that when you do exit out of a game on the Ally, it defaults back to Armory Crate with no easily configurable way, or at least none that I've found, to have it default back to Steam if that's where the bulk of your games are. If most of yours aren't in Steam, this might not be an issue for you, but speaking personally, this is where the vast majority of my library lives, and I'd rather just go back to Steam when I close out of a game if possible, rather than popping back to the Armory Crate interface. And speaking of getting out of games on the Ally, it can also be kind of rough to get into games on the Ally, but that requires a little bit of clarification. When you're actually staring at the Steam or Armory Crate interface on the Ally when launching a game, normally it fires up just fine, and that's great. But if you're booting the system for the first time, you'll have to log into Windows first, and that can be mitigated if you want to follow a guide that goes over how to modify Windows sign-in options to allow for a passwordless sign-in, but that's kind of a pain to set up. Plus, putting aside the initial boot up, the Ally doesn't always wake up cleanly after you put it to sleep, either because the fingerprint scanner's acting up, or some games just don't resume well. Not to mention, like I covered in a previous video, occasionally I found my Ally just boots into the BIOS for reasons completely unknown to me. And as far as waking back up goes, I'm sure if it's a game-specific issue, there are definitely similar times you could encounter this on the deck, but even having spent a comparatively short time with the Ally, these issues are either non-existent at the OS level, or far less frequent if it's a buggy game that's causing issues on the Steam Deck. Overall, it's just a lot quicker to get to games on the deck, whether that's coming from a boot or waking from sleep. And next up, while we're on the subject of getting to things quickly, I have to say the lack of trackpads on the Ally really didn't make a huge difference to me, and that's mostly because I really never used them for gaming that much on the deck anyways. However, where I did notice it start to make a difference was when it came to those times when I was not interacting with the game, but rather needed to navigate on-screen elements that had nothing to do with the gaming, whether that was a launcher or other Windows elements that will pop up on screen like dialog boxes or places where you need really fine control. Now, the Steam Deck doesn't really have this issue that often because the gaming interface is built around gamepad navigation primarily, and then it gives you the option to hold the Steam button to start mousing around as if you're in a PC environment. And the closest analog the Ally really has to this is using the analog sticks in these scenarios, which is objectively less precise than the touchpad. And sometimes, even if you have the control mode set to auto in the command center interface, the Ally doesn't always recognize that right analog stick should be mousing around rather than acting like an analog stick, so you'll have to bring up command center first and manually switch the control mode from auto to desktop to get your mouse to respond. And finally, probably the most important area where I think the deck comes out on top over the Ally, and maybe the least obvious at a glance if you're not familiar, is an SD card reliability, and we do have some interesting updates on that front. Most of the time on both the Steam Deck and the Ally, I've tried to limit the storage to SSD to get the best performance and cleanest operation. But I test a lot of games on this channel, and the SD card's been pretty important to me as a way to separate out games that I'm testing for videos versus the ones that I just want to keep installed locally for my personal enjoyment to play, or just games that I really want to play that are way bigger than the space left on my SSD. And the deck has been pretty much bulletproof over the last year, and I've never really had any issues using an SD card with it. Sure, the initial allocation of space when downloading a new game might take a little bit longer with its comparatively slower speeds, but beyond that, and maybe slightly longer loading times, my 1TB microSD card did just fine on the deck. But like I mentioned in that accessories video for the Ally a few weeks back, I'm just not comfortable upgrading to a UHS 2 speed card for the Ally because, at present, it only worked for me for about a week using a regular SD card, so I'm not real hot on the idea of using that for any extended period of time. Now, people had speculated that this likely stemmed from the SD card reader on the Ally being right next to its exhaust vent at the top of the system. And while my card still worked when I put it into another device, that didn't inspire a lot of confidence, and I also suspected that heat was the issue. Well, as of the most recent Ally update, it looks like they've confirmed this, as it appears the update addresses the SD card problem by increasing the fan speed in turbo mode when you've got the system plugged in or running off of a backup battery. Now, I haven't really had enough time with the update yet to really test this, but it is a little bit concerning to me that what appears to be a hardware design flaw is being addressed by, or at least mitigated by, a software update that really just makes the fan spin faster. And while I'm glad Asus is trying to address the problem, it's definitely something consumers should be aware of, because I would think that an SD card reader that might potentially destroy what could be a very expensive SD card is a pretty egregious problem. And again, this is something that I never worried about on the Steam Deck, and when you look at an SD card reader on a device, you don't really think, oh, this might completely destroy the card that I'm using with it. So yeah, I think this kind of lands in the sweet spot between something that is not incredibly obvious, but is pretty impactful if you're not aware of it. Now, I know on at least some level this might sound like I'm just a rabid Steam Deck fanboy who's just taking cheap shots at the Ally, but I promise you that isn't the case. And in fact, I'm probably spending more time playing the Ally than the deck right now just so I can see how really high-quality AAA games look on it, like Spider-Man and Ghostwire Tokyo. But I also wanted to contribute to the conversation about where the Ally isn't quite up to snuff, not because I want the Ally to fail or anything, but because I want as many high-quality devices in this category as possible to succeed. And the good news is that most of the deficiencies that I took issue with on the Ally are software-based and probably addressable via an update. Well, maybe except for the SD card problem, but jury's still out on that, and at least Asus has acknowledged it at this point. And because it wouldn't be fair to just make a video about how much better the deck is than the Ally, of course I'm going to do a follow-up video where I talk about the areas where I think the Ally comes out on top over the deck. But hey, what about you? If you have experience with both systems, are there any other things that I've forgotten here where you think the Ally isn't quite up to snuff when compared to the Steam Deck as its forerunner? If so, let me know in the comments below. As always, thanks so much for your time, have an amazing day, and I'll see you on the next one.